to Inquiring Minds, the Writing and Literacy SIG podcast. I'm Molly, your host for our final episode for the fall 2024 semester. We're delighted to have you join us today on Acquiring Minds as we delve into discussions relevant to the writing and literacies fields.
And I'm Tori, your co-host. The Writing and Literacy SIG podcast is committed to highlighting scholarly work, exploring current topics, and nurturing dialogue among community members of the special interest group and the wider writing and literacies community. Our aim is to ignite discussions nationwide amongst faculty, graduate students, and anyone intrigued by the pertinent themes within the realms of writing, literacies, and education at large.
In this episode of Inquiring Minds, we're excited to be joined by 5 guests who are going to contribute to this discussion on multimodal authoring. Please welcome Dr. Trevor Boffone, Dr. Carmen Medina, Dr. Danielle Rosvally, Dr. Ankhi Thakurta, and Dr. Shirin Vossoughi. Now, each guest will introduce themselves. Could you please share your name, your institutional or community affiliations, and anything else you believe is relevant to our discussion?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Boffone, Trevor Boffone. I'm in Houston, Texas at the University of Houston. I actually I have published in literacy and, I've done my literacy thing, but I also, I do a lot of things in social media at large. And so I have partnered with Danielle Rosvally, Dr. Rosvally, who's with us today. And we have a project called Yossified Shakespeare, where we are taking literacy to TikTok and Shakespeare literacies. So I don't know if that's a good segue for Danielle to jump in.
Yeah, I'll hop in here. I'm Danielle Rosvally. I'm an assistant professor of theater at the University of Buffalo, and I'm a Shakespearean scholar. And I come to this conversation by way of our Yossified Shakespeare project, where we've been doing a lot of educational work on TikTok. But then also sort of the flip side of the coin is teaching scholars how to use TikTok as an archive. So I've recently done some publishing along those lines as well.
So I'm Carmen Medina, and I'm a professor at Seattle University, and I'm from Puerto Rico. And my work has traditionally been at the intersection and critical literacy and drama practices, and with that, very particular emphasis of improvisation and embodiment as decolonial practices, particularly as it relates to communities in Puerto Rico. I run a project, it's over 10 years old in Puerto Rico, that is called Semillero de Literacidades Insumisas, which is a seedbed of, how do you say insumisas? I'll tell you later, literacies, or that's your homework as we work across languages. So very excited to be here and to be part of this conversation with all of you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shirin Vossoughi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor at Northwestern University in the Learning Sciences program. I study the relationships between human learning and social change, and I think a lot about the kind of cultural and political and ethical and historical dimensions of moment-to-moment teaching and learning interactions, which is part of what has brought me to multimodal and artistic methodologies in order to understand the transformative power of these kinds of learning environments and also the brilliance of learners.
Right. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Ankhi Thakurta. I'm an assistant professor at Boston College at the Lynch School of Education in the Teaching Curriculum and Society Department. I'm originally an immigrant from India, and my work focuses on immigrant youth literacies, and I'm particularly interested in young people of Asian origin. And I'm really just interested in different ways of meaning making and how youth kind of are expanding the scope of this thing we call the arena of public life. And that's kind of where my interest in multimodality kind of fits in to this conversation, because I'm really interested in youth's creative practices. And then also I'm a visual artist, so there is a layer of multimodality that's wrapped up in my own personal identity as well.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Our first question is about the many forms of composing represented across this group. Tell us how multimodal, arts-based, embodied, or digital composing relates to your work and the broader literacies field.
Well, for Yossified Shakespeare, our project actually started in spring 2020 22, I don't know, a few years ago. And essentially, we had this idea to write a book about Yossified Shakespeare, which, to put briefly, is a project looking at these digital appropriations and remixes of Shakespearean content through a millennial, very digital lens. So think of things on TikTok or RuPaul's Drag Race, so on and so forth. And I'm a content creator already. I was doing the TikTok thing, the Instagram thing, and Danielle peer pressured me, forced us into starting a Yossified Shakespeare TikTok account where we actually have been documenting the process of writing the book and creating content around the content in the book. And so it's actually been a really interesting process for us to not only just have fun and to really, build our co-writing, co-partner bonds, but we've also been able to think through ideas in the book. So if we're working on a chapter that's about RuPaul's Drag Race, for instance, we'll create content that is accessible, that is 90 seconds, 60 seconds in these little chunks that actually help us think through our ideas and to get real-time feedback from our audience. So we're very small. We have 2,500 or so followers on TikTok, but we regularly get, thousands of views on our videos, and a lot of, conversation is engendered by what we're doing. And so it's actually been a really interesting process of learning about how to write and how to think about scholarship and how to think about accessibility for scholarship. And so that's just one of the things that we are doing and something we're thinking through. We also have a series of videos that's called Writing a Book, and it's actually just teaching people about the process of writing a book. Like, how do you write an abstract? How do you talk to editors? How do you work with peer reviewers? Or not work with, but respond to peer reviewers, so on and so forth.
We've also run several workshops at this point for fellow faculty members to talk through how they can follow a similar model with their work. And for us, sometimes the work starts in the TikTok idea and then expands out to the academic thought. And sometimes it's the academic thought that the exercise of condensing it down to the TikTok idea helps us clarify the thought. So we found it very productive.
I can talk a little bit about the work that's happening in Puerto Rico. So I think the idea of embodiment has been at the root of many of the work that I have done since I've been in college, working with more radical and participatory forms of theater. So that's really my background, and I come into literacy from that work. And for me, there are two things, and I think it relates to what Trevor and Danielle was saying in terms of there are two parallel things happening here that overlap. One is the work that we do with teachers and in classrooms in Puerto Rico to think of how with our bodies that are always present, we can start rehabilitating learning spaces and reclaiming them in relation to the colonial trajectory of Puerto Rico with the United States, and to be very explicit about those particular things. We are in our notion of decoloniality, we think, how do we acknowledge and honor gender bodies, racialized bodies within and dominated bodies within the context of a colonial relationship, and how embodiment serves as a way to create ruptures in the work that we do, from children to pre-service teachers and in-service teachers and other members of the community. So that's a little bit of the core of the work that we're doing. And part of with that is also the work that we've been thinking lately. I work a lot with Mia Perry from the University of Glasgow and Karen Woolan at Indiana University, which we wrote a book on playfulness as a method. So after years of being, all of us doing engaged work in drama and play and across ages, we realized that we always talk about playfulness as a pedagogical method, but not as a research method. So lately, we've been very much playing with, our last book, if you look at it, we're really wrestling with representation. If this is a book about playfulness, and playful methods. How do we construct a playful book that engages people and researchers in literacy and in education in those practices? So it's difficult, no? There's a lot of tension because the book is a book and it's with words. So it's been a very interesting experiment for us and to engage researchers, particularly novice researchers, in the idea of let's play and let's think, what do we construct as new meanings? What emerges as new, and how does that relate to the support of a decolonial imagination and a new set of ways of existing and imagining?
I feel like I can jump in there. I see some connections, Carmen, with what you just shared. One of the connections that I see in the work that I've had a chance to contribute to is the relationship between artistic, creative, and playful pedagogies with young people and the methodologies that we use to understand those spaces. And so I definitely resonate with that. And I think that for me, as somebody who's been really interested in critical pedagogy and political education and how to do that type of education in healthful ways that are supportive of students' dreaming and their well-being, art and play have always been really central to that. And so I've thought a lot about when it comes to the domain learning of like reading and writing, or science or different kinds of, disciplinary practices, what does it look like to bring in the arts and imagination and playfulness?
So I think multimodal arts-based composing enters into my work at a couple of different levels. So one of the things that I'm interested in is what kinds of educational spaces can create conditions for youth's civic literacies to flourish. And so oftentimes in my research, I adopt pedagogical practitioner methods and actually facilitate inquiry communities where youth explore their civic identities and their different aspirations. And very often I will integrate sort of arts-based composing prompts that invite students to kind of draw on multiple communicative resources to express themselves, to create things like learning dedications. Who are they dedicating their learning to? And then really expressing themselves through the linguistic, but also beyond it in many different ways. And then there is another level of it as well. As I mentioned, as a visual artist, I have been thinking a little bit about what it means to integrate the arts into data analysis. So something that I've been just sort of playing around with since grad school actually is visual memoing. So I will take sort of big concepts and ideas in my research and try to grapple with them through painting. And that's been another really interesting way that I think the arts has kind of found its way into my work.
Thank you all so much. So I'm hearing so many exciting ideas about academic ideas circulating to make ideas more accessible. I've started to hear some thoughts about rooting our work in decoloniality and playfulness. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. What theories or traditions or practices really guide your composing and your research? Where do you draw inspiration from?
I guess for me, it's been a learning and curve, and visiting and revisiting the ethics of my work and what I want to accomplish. So in that sense, if you look at the previous work that I did on critical literacy, was more situated in traditional Western theories of critical theory, which it still is, because even Freire has a very critical Western framework that he's relying on. Or if you think of someone like, I don't know, Caribbean scholars like Glissant that borrow so much from Deleuze and Guattari. So all of these things are very complicated. But I have been more intentional about how perspective from the global, what's known as the global South, inform my work and create these intentional ruptures. So So I'm using more of the work of people, like I said, like Lisanne or Walter Mignolo or Catherine Walter, all these people who are more situated in global south perspectives on decoloniality. So that's kind of like I think the idea of being deliberate as you move as a scholar and to engage the contradictions that are embedded in your theory are very significant for me. So thinking of embodiment from a cultural perspective, from theater groups that do anthropological work, like in Peru, like the Yuyashkani. So how does that work informs my pedagogy? So it's kind of like being right now for me is about thinking of decoloniality as a very intentional exercise to understand the work that I do, being informed from another perspective.
For us, we're constantly striving to create more access. A question we ask ourselves consistently is, what did we wish we had known when we were leaving graduate school or writing our first books or whatever? And there's always been this invisible syllabus behind academia. People who are better connected will have a sense of it, which means that historically majoritized students from a historically majoritized background have a higher possibility of success. So tearing down those walls involves just sort of pulling away all of these masks and veils that are put in front of information. So we have really strived to make our content accessible to an intelligent high schooler, right? Like if you have a high school diploma, you should be able to understand what we are saying. And that's been sort of the guiding factor behind our accessibility mission.
Danielle, that's a great way to articulate it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'll also add, when I wrote my first book, Renegades, which was about Black content creators on TikTok, essentially making this culture that was being widespread beyond social media. I wrote about it from the perspective of my classroom. I was actually writing about what my students and I were doing. And I wanted to write a book that my students could read, my high school students could read. They don't even have diplomas yet. Well, now they do, most of them, I'm sure. But I feel like the accessibility was always something that a switch that turned on at that point, like in 2020, 2021. And so everything that we're doing, Danielle and I, is very much about accessibility, because at the end of the day, if we're doing, I think we believe what we're doing is social justice work. I know it's Shakespeare, but we're also looking at queer Shakespeare and marginalized people engaging with Shakespeare. But it's social justice work, and part of social justice work is very much being accessible, right? And so we want our book to also be, our work, excuse me, to be legible on multiple planes as well. So it's not just, we've done the journal articles, we've done the book chapters, we're writing a book, but we also know that not everyone's going to go read, whatever the journal is, the academic journal. And we know that not everyone's going to go spend $30 on this book when it comes out. But our content on social media is free. You just need to have a phone with internet connection, and you can do all of the learning that someone with a PhD from Harvard can do.
I think I'm hearing a lot of echoes and similarities between what folks have said and what I myself am thinking. I definitely draw a lot of inspiration from transnational feminist thinkers in my work. I'm, really compelled by people who have broadened our understandings of who is a knower and what it means to build knowledge and move through the world. So for instance, Gloria Anzaldúa has been really on my mind lately. And then in addition to that, as I was thinking about this conversation, I ended up reflecting a little bit about artistic practices that have been, kind of just living in and through my own family. So for instance, I was thinking about my mother, who was a beautiful dancer when she was younger. I was thinking of my father, who used to play the drums. My grandfather was a visual artist. My grandmother was a very talented seamstress. And it just made me remember that my own interest in the arts is not an outlier even within my own family. And I also don't think that I'm unique in that. I know for a fact that the many students who I've been lucky to work with have these incredible creative traditions that are kept alive across generations in their families. And that's something that gives me a lot of inspiration too. And I'm almost always wondering how we can center those in our practice as well as our research.
So we've heard about the decolonizing critical perspectives and drawing on embodiment and pulling away the veils of the invisible syllabi, which I'm definitely going to add that to my toolkit. And just making information more accessible through social media, through these multimodal ways, and the connections across our own family and historical experiences. So we've heard about those who speak to you, and our next question is, who do you hope that your work speaks to? And what do you envision as the audience for your compositions?
Okay, I'll go. So, from the very beginning, the last 2.5 years, we have been working on cultivating an audience for our book whenever it comes out. I think that was the core of what we started doing. And I think along the way, we realized that it's a lot more than that. It's about creating this conversation in real time with another group or with a whole group of people that are interested in not just theater, uh, early modern literature, Shakespeare, all of these things, even people that are just interested in England, right? We have a lot of, uh, or musical theater, millennial culture, all these things are part of our content. And what's been interesting is just the community that we've been able to form through these little short videos. We call the larger community Shakes Talk, the Shakespeare TikTok community. But in reality, we've been able to connect with other content creators doing theater content, musical theater content. We love boy bands around here. We are divided, I will say. I am a NSYNC person, and Danielle is thoroughly Backstreet Boys. Um, Oh, I feel like this group is more Backstreet Boys. Okay. I'll forgive y'all. But what's really been interesting is just sort of shifting what we're doing based on the feedback we're getting and continuing sort of onward. And so, a lot of times when people listening to this, I'm sure people have written a book. Yes, and Juliet. But we typically will write a book, and this is for anyone who's a writer, but you write a book, you publish it, it comes out, and then you start marketing it. And so we have essentially started marketing this book before we even wrote a word or a sentence. And so that's been, I think, a really interesting part of this to us, and just to get feedback on what people want out of us, out of our work, and what sort of questions they have about our work. And we create content responding to it. So if I make a video about the musical & Juliet, which we've made many about & Juliet, and someone asks a question about the Backstreet Boys, we then will make a video about the Backstreet Boys. And it just becomes this loop of engagement and really sort of engendering this conversation about the work we're doing.
The other thing we've been able to see is who really needs the community. We recently had a video go semi-viral where we were responding to, there was a trend on TikTok where people were making a trauma dump salad. So they would dump different kinds of candy into a bowl and then talk about their trauma. So ballet trauma or whatever. So we made a grad school trauma dump salad, and it's how many views are we up to? Like over 50,000 at this point? 60,000?
Over 100,000.
Okay, so I undersold us. Yeah. And what we found were a lot of people in the comments saying, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. Like I thought I was the only one who had these experiences. I was so alone. We even had people reaching out in DMs. So a huge part of what this has become is just sort of shining a spotlight on not just the positive experiences that we have, but also, the trials and tribulations and things that go wrong, just to make people know that they aren't alone and bad things happen to all of us.
Yeah, someone commented, there's hundreds of comments, but someone asked, what grad school did y'all go to? And I was like, literally any grad school. Like, even if you had the most positive grad school experience, there was still a toxic professor. There was still some sort of bureaucratic trauma. we all have that shared experience, but it's not, we don't talk about it in public spaces.
And my graduate students have since come up to me and been like, I can't believe that happened to you. And I'm like, oh, and we were just getting started, right? Like we stopped recording and realized we could have done 2 or 3 more videos about this.
I think that, as I listen to you, this is like so significant, and also in relation to creating a community that could perhaps provide alternative, so like I said, we're all alone in this process. It doesn't matter how wonderful our experience might have been. There are all this trauma, but just creating this huge collective of I'm not alone. It just feels so powerful and healing in many ways, which is always sometimes so difficult to articulate. So we all know what our traumas are, and we can talk about them together, but to construct a community like this, that feels so powerful. I think in my case is more, it, it it's more related to the communities that I work with. That's my first and foremost, most important audience. The communities that I work with in Puerto Rico, and very in that sense, it's very traditional. I mean, I'm interested in working with teacher educators, educators in communities, and children. So that's in some sense my audience. But I think that at the scholarly level, there is all. I also feel that I have the responsibility to help people understand what are the conditions. I mean, what Puerto Rico, what's education, what are the conditions, what are our responsibilities here in the United States, and to really create some awareness of who we are and what's happening, because I feel that most people don't know. So I think that there's, in that sense, it's those are, I think, the two audiences that I think of.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Carmen said. I think I hope very much that my work can potentially speak to multiple audiences. So I think, like Carmen, first and foremost, I hope that my work speaks to the communities that I get to work with. So immigrant youth and their wider, family networks as well. And on, I think, that more scholarly level, I do have the privilege of working with pre-service teachers, and of course, writing research articles. And so hoping that some of this work might, I don't know, inspire people to give themselves permission to bring more of themselves into scholarly endeavors. I know certainly that reading the work of other scholars who have centered multimodality or arts-based approaches has given me that kind of permission. So if I can help in some ways with that, that would be very meaningful. But I was thinking as well, one of the tensions that I feel like I'm struggling with, so for instance, in this work with communities and youth, is how to make some of these more kind of attempts to be more democratizing and sort of connect that in a way that's meaningful to youth. Because ultimately I end up writing these scholarly articles, right? And those are not accessible formats for young people, even though they're brilliant. And as we've talked about before in this conversation, it's just a specialized kind of training that we need to like access this form of knowledge. But I do wonder about that all the time, the tension between what I'm writing about and the format that it's written in. So yeah, I don't know. And how that forecloses engaging with audiences, maybe.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about your audiences. The audiences that we're thinking about span from, thousands of viewers on TikTok, creating alternative communities with collective experiences and healing spaces. We're thinking about the local communities that we work in, communities in Puerto Rico, the family and youth that we're connected with in our work. And we're really thinking about this tension between what we produce and the people that we hope will see it. And so our final question we wanted to think about and sort of bring it into thinking about a K-12 space, because we do have some listeners that are K-12 teachers. And so we were wondering about your work with multimodal composing, and what you think that means for what counts as literacy in K-12 schools.
So I have been teaching for 16 years, and I've done my fair share of time in high school. And I loved high school. I just was burnt out and I had to quit. I didn't want to quit, but Anyway, I'm not going to trauma dump right now. We will save that for TikTok. But something I was doing as early as 2019, early 2019, was having my students, I was teaching Spanish, Spanish 1, Spanish 2, so very elementary level Spanish. And I was having my students essentially write stories in Spanish and do these on TikTok. So they were using different storytelling methods, whether it was text on screen, skits, speaking, but they were essentially doing the same thing they would do in a written composition. Or for people listening, you might have done like a comic strip, right? In like a Spanish or a language class in high school. And so essentially it was like that. And my students, what I've quickly learned was that young people, and this anyone who teaches will know this, even though they are always online and always on computers and phones, they largely don't know how to use these things, right? They don't know how to email and attach things and save things and find them and manipulate technology in the way that like millennials, like we know how to do technology. It's in our bones. And so I quickly learned that it was in terms of digital literacy, we were literally telling stories using a digital means, but also learning how to create with a platform that we didn't know how to create with, right? And so they're learning on multiple planes and getting these different types of literacies in a class where people don't think of, I know everyone listening to this podcast like understands like a high school Spanish class is doing literacy work, but a lot of people don't think that, right? They think literacy has to be in an English classroom. And so this storytelling, just really tapping into it in a way that the students were excited about, because the students were essentially creating on a platform that they feel like is their native like home platform. And so I've carried this into my work with my university students. I teach queer studies at the University of Houston, and my students make TikToks. We have a class TikTok account. We have they have assignments every semester that are not graded. They're just vibe assignments where they're in groups. I give them a topic. I give them a full class period. They go off around campus, they make content, and then we have a micro film festival at the end of class. And they end up learning a lot about the process. They learn about the topic as well. But there's no sort of rubric. They don't have a rubric. They don't get graded. And it's a really powerful experience for them. They always end up loving it. And it ends up being like one of the best classes of the semester. And so there's different ways I've been incorporating this into my work now. And it's really been a game changer to just think about how using different platforms can really expand the way that people tell their stories, that people think through ideas, and that people really take agency of the work we've always been doing in schools.
A thing I've been thinking about very recently with media literacy, this is a true story. It happened in my class yesterday. I'm teaching a class on queer Shakespeare's, and it is a undergraduate class. So the seminar runs simultaneously with grad students and undergrads. Our graduate students are master's or PhD students. So I have a broad swath of experiences in this room. And we were discussing a cultural theorist who has a sort of complicated identity marker background. And one of the graduate students asked some specific questions about the identity marker background because he had done some looking into this person. And it's a very open room. One of the undergrads just said, "Oh, I'll Google it." And the response was, "Well, you're welcome to, but I already did that. That's why I'm asking an expert this question." But there are times in class where it's like, yes, someone please Google this because I'm giving you a date and I'm not sure if the date is correct. So a thing that I'm working on currently, particularly with my younger students, is how to tell the difference between information that is viably given on the internet and information that you need to actually talk to an expert to glean. And once you know the difference, then like, how do you acquire this information? So that is a literacy that I'm working on in my classroom.
I think for me, the most significant experience, I do a lot of this work with children, particularly young children. And it was a work I got a lot of tracking, I think because of the transgressive nature of it. And it wasn't our idea, it was the children idea. The work that we did in Puerto Rico working with telenovelas. And you're probably familiar with than TV genre. And, you know, the complexity of how telenovelas work as an first of all is the intended audience is not children, but it's a common cultural practices around Latino communities. And so children do have access to it, and it is not my job as a researcher or as facilitator to decide if I ask what media genre you wanted to explore. That was the beginning of the inquiry, and how we were going to explore it through embodied practices. We thought they were going to say video games or cartoons, and then they said telenovelas, and we were shocked, in denial of trying to find a way not to acknowledge it until we realized this is it. You don't ask if you don't want to acknowledge and honor. And it was in many ways so interesting, because it was very risky, but at the same time it was so generative in terms of the multiplicity of literacies that we were able to explore, and how do we negotiate it, disruptions to have conversations about power and representation in telenovela, at the same time that we are not saying, well, you cannot watch that is wrong. So we were in our toes in that sense with everyday media literacies that are risky but that are present. So and our roles as researchers in terms of power and a claim of being critical educators. So I think that's one of those examples of what I have done, especially with young children. There was a lot about, why are you doing this with third graders? And I'm like, they know about this. They're bringing their knowledge. So it's there. So we can hide it and keep it outside of the classroom, but it ended up being a really fascinating learning for us in terms of the work that we do with young children. And I learned from Carol Woolman so much about this, how much risk do we take in allowing and facilitating spaces for young children to bring their perspectives in the class.
I mean, I feel like I'm just sitting here taking tons of notes for things that I would love to try in the future. I mean, I think broadly, this is not going to be like a revolutionary statement, certainly not on this podcast, but I think hopefully it's an invitation to my work and just like the work of everyone else here, is an invitation to think of ways that creative, artistic invitations can be made in every content area. It doesn't matter what discipline you're in, but just creating these openings and opportunities for people to bring in their multiple ways of knowing and being and creating. And I can think of one example recently from my teaching here at BC. So I work with pre-service educators who are undergrads, and part of their experience is they do these sort of practicum placements where they'll go to a local high school and they'll do some observations of classes, and then they'll get a chance to teach demo lessons and get feedback, etc. And there's a really interesting shift in my course, because they don't go right away. They spend a few weeks just in the class, coming to BC first, and then about midway-ish through the semester, they start going to the high school. And then that's when it becomes a reality, and then they're fully immersed in, the world of public school. And so around that time, I like to do this sort of creative activity where they come back and they collage about their experiences in the school. And this was something that was co-developed with an amazing doctoral student who I worked with last year, Allie Blake. So shout out to Allie for this great idea. But it is routinely such a powerful and revealing activity. And students, sometimes they're a little unsure about doing it because it is kind of a departure from ways they're typically expressed or asked to express their knowledge in college classrooms. But it's always a very revealing experience. And so I think just little opportunities like that can really go a long way.
Yeah, I love what you just said, Ankhi. And I think what I find with college students is that by the time they get to us, the creativity has been taken out of them by the education system, whether it's public education, even private schools. And so when you ask them to do something outside the box, to do something creative, they immediately think it's going to be easy. And they
Yes. Thank you for
always,
saying that. Yep.
right, they think it's going to be easy.
Yeah.
And the feedback I always get is that it isn't easy because we're forcing them to use their brain in a way that they have lost. Most of them have lost, unless they're like a theater major or an art major, or whatever it might be. But they have gotten out of practice of being creative with displaying their knowledge, talking about their stories, talking about who they are. And so it's really powerful when we reintroduce these assignments. And sometimes, I will pair, I don't know what y'all do, but I will pair the outside the box idea with a traditional idea. So in one of my classes, the students have, for their final project, they have to make a long form TikTok. So like 90 seconds, 2 minutes, where they are teaching about something or they're doing a reading of something. And they have to pair that with a written assignment as well. So they're thinking in the way that they are trained to think, and then they're thinking in a way that is new to them, that they think is going to be easy, but actually ends up not being easy. Because I'm going to tell y'all, anyone listening to this, to concisely have an argument in 60 seconds in a video without like blah, 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 is difficult. And it's an art that you have to master. So everyone go out and try your hand at TikToking after this.
Amazing. All right, we've heard about multimodal literacies across platforms such as TikTok, telenovelas, and in teacher preparation programs. These creative efforts make space for multiple ways of knowing and being, and to tell stories and think through ideas to understand the work that is going on in K through 20 schools, and how we might cross these boundaries through multimodal and arts-based practices. We deeply appreciate the time of these scholars and their efforts to make literacy more accessible and to put multimodality into practice, or back into practice. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of Inquiring Minds podcast, focused on the multimodal authoring of scholars. And a big thank you to our participants, Drs. Boffone, Medina, Rosvally, Thakurta, and Vossoughi, for an engaging and delightful conversation. We have thoroughly enjoyed hearing from these amazing scholars and know our listeners will as well.